Hello, dear listeners, and welcome back to Sci-fi Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with zero budget to keep operating. If you enjoyed today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking team to survive and keep bringing you these tales. You can donate by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the link in the video description or comments. 10,000 interconnected worlds went dark in a single millisecond. The slipstream core, the pulsating heart of the Galactic Alliance, simply stopped. There was no explosion, no warning siren, no catastrophic failure cascade. The greatest technological marvel in history died with a quiet, breathless click, plunging trillions of souls into absolute isolation. It was not a malfunction. It was an amputation. High Inspector Kalen, a veteran investigator of the Vorth race, stood frozen in the grand observatory of Capital Prime. His segmented mandibles tightened against his jaw as he stared at the impossible telemetry scrolling across his optical display. The grand holographic map of the galaxy, usually a brilliant, pulsing web of blue trade routes, was completely black. His comms device vibrated violently against his chest plate. It was a Priority 1 distress signal from the outer rim, followed immediately by another from the inner core, and then a tidal wave of panic flooding the entire communication spectrum. Kalen rushed to the Central Intelligence Hub, shoving past panicked politicians. The formal report he received upon arrival defied every known law of physics and logic. The human navigators were gone. Humanity, considered a lower-tier species, possessed the only biological architecture capable of enduring the psychological radiation of the slipstream without suffering neural collapse. Because of this, they had served as the biological keys to the core for a century. Now, every single human operator, stationed across thousands of relay sectors, had vanished. They had evaporated from sealed, heavily guarded space stations without leaving a single trace of physical evidence. Security feeds showed them sitting at their consoles 1 second, and in the next frame, empty uniforms collapsed onto the floor. Steam still rose from their cups of synthetic coffee. The consoles remained perfectly intact. They were just gone. Within 48 hours, the glittering utopia of the Galactic Alliance began to cannibalize itself. Without faster-than-light capabilities, the mighty empires of the galaxy were instantly paralyzed. The superior species, who had grown fat, wealthy, and complacent on instantaneous trade, found themselves hopelessly trapped, orbiting metropolises of glass and steel, which produced absolutely zero agricultural output of their own, faced immediate and brutal starvation. Pleasure planets dissolved into anarchic war zones as life support systems began to fail. The elite citizens, who had never known a single day of struggle, began slaughtering each other in the streets for the final drops of fusion energy. The Golden Age shattered into blood and riot in a matter of hours. Kalen tuned out the frantic screaming of the High Council echoing through his earpiece. He isolated himself inside the cavernous, silent central control room of the main slipstream terminal. He ran his four-fingered hand over the primary human interface chair. The leather was cold. Kalen was an investigator, and his instincts screamed that an event of this magnitude required deliberate, calculated precision. He plunged his consciousness deep into the diagnostic logs of the terminal, tearing through layers of dead code and silent machinery. There, hidden beneath a mountain of corrupted data, he found a ghost. It was a localized encryption pulse, a tiny fragment of data deliberately left behind, like a calling card in a pristine crime scene. "Computer, isolate and run a biometric trace on this cipher," Kalen commanded, his rough voice echoing in the empty hall. The automated system replied instantly. "Match found. Signature belongs to Camden Blevins, Chief Slipstream Architect, Species Human." Kalen felt a sharp chill run down his spine. Camden Blevins was a ghost even before this catastrophic event. A highly reclusive genius who designed the neural bridges keeping the core stable. Kalen ran the decryption sequence, bracing himself. He fully expected a ransom demand, a bitter manifesto of human rebellion, or perhaps a formal declaration of war against the Alliance. Instead, a sharp hum filled the room, and a massive holographic projection bloomed from the floor. It was not a message of hate. It was a star map, a glowing, crimson trajectory pierced straight through the charted, safe territories of the Alliance, diving headfirst into the uncharted blackness. The line terminated at a precise set of coordinates deep inside the gray abyss. Kalen felt a heavy dread pool in his primary stomach. The gray abyss was a colossal region of dead space, utterly devoid of starlight, ambient radiation, or life. It was a graveyard of physics, strictly forbidden by a century-old Alliance decree. No ship had ever entered it and returned. The High Council was currently locked in a useless, terrified debate over planetary rationing and martial law. Kalen knew they were wasting precious time. Survival did not lie in hiding and waiting for the end. The answer, the absolute truth behind the darkest day in galactic history, lay at the end of that crimson line. He strode out of the control room, his mind locking onto a desperate, dangerous plan. He could not use the sleek, modern cruisers of the Alliance. They were nothing more than expensive metal coffins without the core. He needed a relic. He needed a ship that did not rely on the slipstream. "I need a tactical squad assembled at Hangar 7 in exactly 1 hour." Kalen barked into his secure communicator, intentionally overriding the chaotic military channels. "Requisition the Iron Vanguard. We are taking the old fusion drive dreadnought off the grid." A panicked commanding officer crackled back over the line. "Sir, without faster-than-light capabilities, those primitive fusion drives will take months to reach anywhere. Where in the void are we going?" Kalen looked back one last time at the glowing red line pointing into the endless dark. He adjusted his heavy coat and narrowed his 4 eyes. "We are going to find the architect. We are going to ask the humans why they abandoned us to die." For 3 agonizing months, the Iron Vanguard crawled through the suffocating dark of standard space. Without the magic of instantaneous travel, the galaxy was suddenly vastly, terrifyingly empty. Through the long-range optical arrays, High Inspector Kalen watched the so-called civilized universe eat itself alive. The majestic sovereign worlds of the inner rings, places that had proudly declared themselves the pinnacles of biological evolution, were now burning. Without the constant influx of automated supply freighters, their artificial atmospheres were failing. Kalen stood on the observation deck, watching a silent, distant feed of a Vorthon pleasure colony tearing itself apart. Dignitaries who once draped themselves in spun silk were now butchering each other in the streets with sharpened pipes, warring over a single, failing thermal generator. The Supreme Empires were using primitive kinetic orbital bombardments, dropping raw asteroids onto rival cities just to steal a few days' worth of stored solar energy. The sheer arrogance of the Alliance, built on a foundation of borrowed miracles, had shattered under the weight of harsh reality. Locked in his dim quarters during the long cycles, Kalen dug deeper into the ancient, unredacted Alliance databases stored on the dreadnought. He was looking for clues about Camden Blevins, but what he found was a century of systemic, cold-blooded exploitation. The official historical texts claimed the humans were honored partners, uniquely gifted operators entrusted with the galaxy's most important job. The classified medical files told a viciously different story. Humanity was never a partner. They were an expendable biological component. The core systems emitted a highly specific band of psychological radiation, a mind-warping frequency that caused immediate madness and neural death in every higher-tier species. Only the dense, uniquely hardened neural architecture of the human brain could absorb that radiation without instantly collapsing. For 100 years, the Alliance had used them as cheap, replaceable fuses. They threw human operators into the radiation chambers, knowing the prolonged exposure would eventually hollow them out, simply because it was cheaper than engineering proper mechanical shielding. The Alliance had built its glittering utopia on the quiet, agonizing sacrifices of a species they secretly despised as primitive. A violent jolt threw Kalen against the bulkheads, ripping him away from his grim research. Red emergency lighting flooded the corridors. The ship groaned under a massive kinetic impact. Kalen rushed to the bridge. "Report!" he barked, pulling himself into the commander's seat. "We are under attack, Inspector," the tactical officer shouted over the shrieking alarms. "Multiple unregistered vessels on intercept vectors. It is the Tar Corsairs." Kalen grit his teeth. The Tar Corsairs were a vicious coalition of scavengers and pirates, brutally suppressed when the Galactic security grid was active. Now, with the police force paralyzed, the predators had come out to feast. Their ships were ugly, jagged amalgamations of stolen armor, and they were swarming the slow, lumbering iron vanguard like parasites on a dying beast. "Raise the energy shields!" the helmsman cried out in panic. "We have no energy shields," Kalen roared back. "The primary generators require an active network feed. We are running on raw fusion, evasive maneuvers." But the vanguard was too heavy, too ancient. Another kinetic harpoon slammed into their aft hull, tearing through layers of ablative plating. They were going to be boarded, slaughtered, and stripped for parts in the middle of nowhere. Kalen's mind raced. He remembered a file he had skimmed during his research into the human archives. It was a navigation protocol written by Camden Blevins, a theoretical maneuver deemed too suicidal, too utterly chaotic for the civilized Alliance academies to ever teach. "Helm, disengage the inertial dampeners," Kalen ordered, his voice cold and flat. "Set a direct collision course for the dead gas giant in Sector 4. The bridge crew stared at him in absolute horror. "Sir, the gravity well of that mass will crush our hull into dust." "Do it now," Kalen commanded. The helmsman obeyed, his hands shaking as he punched in the coordinates. The massive dreadnought groaned, redirecting all its fusion thrust toward the colossal, dead planet looming in the darkness. The Tar Corsair ships, fueled by bloodlust, and assuming the Vanguard was trying to make a desperate atmospheric crash landing, accelerated and gave chase. "Wait for it," Kalen whispered, watching the proximity alarms scream as the massive gravitational pull of the giant grabbed them. The metal bulkheads screamed. The pressure on the bridge became suffocating. "Now," Kalen shouted. "Hard burn! Reverse polarity! Slingshot us out!" The human maneuver was a masterpiece of raw, physical violence. By burning their engines at the absolute edge of the event horizon, the Vanguard used the planet's gravity to violently whip them outward at a terrifying velocity. The pursuing Tar Corsairs, lacking the heavy fusion thrusters, and caught completely off guard by the sheer insanity of the move, could not correct their trajectory in time. Kalen watched the tactical display as the pirate swarm was dragged relentlessly into the crushing atmosphere of the dead world, their hulls crumpling like cheap tin under the immense gravitational shear. The bridge of the Vanguard fell dead silent, save for the heavy, ragged breathing of the crew. "They wrote it down," the tactical officer whispered, staring at his console in awe. "The humans. They wrote manuals for this." Kalen nodded slowly, wiping a line of purple blood from his mandibles. For decades, the high-born engineers of the Alliance had mocked the human technical manuals. They called them redundant, boring, and obsessively focused on physical survival in worst-case scenarios. The Alliance relied entirely on automated safety nets. But the humans had known. They knew the dark was dangerous, and they had prepared for a universe without miracles. Those boring, ignored protocols were now the only holy texts of survival left in the galaxy. Weeks later, The Iron Vanguard finally crossed the invisible, dreaded boundary of the gray abyss. The crew stood at their stations, tense and silent, expecting to find an empty void or a graveyard of shattered human colony ships. Instead, the forward optical sensors cleared the static, and Kalen felt his breath catch in his throat. It was not a ruin. Floating silently in the absolute darkness was an artificial superfortress of a scale that defied comprehension. It was monstrous, built entirely from the welded, overlapping hulls of thousands of decommissioned human freighters and warships. It had no glowing energy shields, no elegant architectural curves. It was a brutalist mountain of scarred iron and steel, bristling with silent weapon batteries. There were no lights, no beacon signals, but the deep, rhythmic hum of massive fusion reactors vibrating through the hull of the Vanguard proved it was very much alive, waiting quietly in the dark. The heavy airlock of the colossal structure sealed behind Kalen and his boarding party, with a resounding, metallic thud. The interior of the superfortress was a cavernous labyrinth of exposed conduits and towering data stacks, bathed in the faint, amber glow of emergency lumen strips. They advanced in a tight tactical formation, rifles raised, checking every blind corner and shadowed alcove. Yet, their thermal optics registered nothing but the ambient heat of fusion cores. The station was completely devoid of biological life. There were no bodies, no signs of a hasty evacuation, no blast marks on the walls. The automated maintenance drones simply glided past them on silent treads, meticulously cleaning floors that had not seen footprints in what appeared to be months. But there was something else in the air. A low, continuous acoustic frequency vibrated through the deck plating and resonated deep within their skeletal structures. It was not a mechanical hum. It felt almost organic, a slow, rhythmic thrumming that bypassed their auditory receptors and whispered directly into their nervous systems. Kalen felt his 4 ocular lenses grow heavy. His secondary heart rate slowed to a languid crawl. A profound, unnatural sense of peace washed over the boarding party. One of the hardened tactical officers actually lowered his plasma rifle, his eyes drifting shut as if he were being rocked to sleep by an invisible tide. Kalen had to slap his own face, the sharp sting snapping him out of the hypnotic lethargy. He ordered his squad to engage their helmet acoustic dampeners immediately, disturbed by how effortlessly the station had almost sedated them into a permanent slumber. They pushed forward to the central command nexus, a massive spherical chamber dominated by a dormant projection matrix. As Kalen stepped onto the central dais, motion sensors buried in the floor suddenly flared to life. The amber lights dimmed, replaced by a harsh, sterile blue beam firing from the ceiling. A towering, 3-dimensional image flickered into existence. It was Camden Blevins. The human chief architect looked nothing like the sanitized corporate portraits the Alliance used in their propaganda. He looked utterly destroyed. Dark, bruised hollows hung beneath his bloodshot eyes. His skin was pale and drawn tight over his cheekbones, and his graying hair was plastered to his forehead with nervous sweat. Yet, despite the obvious physical deterioration, his expression held an eerie, unshakable calm. He stared straight ahead, as if making eye contact with Kalen across the gulf of space and time. "If you are watching this," Blevins began, his voice dry and echoing through the massive chamber, "it means the network has gone dark, and someone was desperate enough to follow the breadcrumbs. I am recording this exactly 48 hours before we pull the plug. You came looking for answers. You came to find out why we sabotaged the greatest empire in the universe. But the truth is, there never was an empire. There was only a parasite, and the fleas living on its back." Kalen froze, his hand hovering over his recording device. Blevins took a slow, labored breath. "You thought the slipstream was a miracle of physics. You thought your ancestors discovered a subdimension of exotic matter that allowed instant travel across the stars. You were wrong. The tunnels, the fast travel lanes, the glowing blue corridors of the network. They are not spatial anomalies. They are veins. The entire slipstream network is the dormant, vascular system of a multidimensional entity. A cosmic predator, so massive that its biology spans across our galaxy. For thousands of years, the Alliance has been unknowingly flying its ships through the bloodstream of a sleeping god. A cold knot of pure existential terror twisted in Kalen's stomach. The sheer scale of the revelation threatened to crush his sanity. "And we humans," Blevins continued, a bitter smile touching his cracked lips. "We were never your navigators. When the Alliance discovered that our brains could withstand the connection to the core, you thought we were just resilient biological computers. But the entity is entirely psychic. It feeds on consciousness. When thousands of humans plugged their minds into the core, we were not steering your ships. Our collective brainwaves acted as a neurological suppressant. We were the anesthesia. We were the only thing keeping the beast sedated." Blevins leaned closer to the recording lens, his sunken eyes burning with a haunting intensity. Every time a human navigator burned out or went mad, it was not because of mechanical radiation. It was because the entity twitched in its sleep. We have been wrestling with a nightmare for a century, feeding our own minds into its jaws so the rest of the galaxy could play at being royalty. But the beast is adapting. Over the last 5 years, it has begun to generate psychic antibodies against our brainwaves. The sedative is wearing off. Its awakening is now a mathematical certainty. If we had stayed connected to the core for even one more week, the backlash of its waking mind would have incinerated the consciousness of every living being plugged into the network. The holographic architect stepped back, rubbing a weary hand over his face. "We did not shut down the core to destroy you. We shut it down to unhook you from the monster before it opened its eyes." The projection stabilized, leaving Blevins standing in silent vigil. Kalen collapsed into a nearby operative chair, his mind reeling. The missing puzzle pieces violently slammed into place. The humans had not abandoned the Alliance out of spite or a desire for petty revenge over a century of slavery. They had cut the galaxy loose from a tether of certain doom. But if the entity was waking up, it would be starving. It would need to feed on the consciousness of the densely populated Alliance worlds. Kalen looked at the empty, massive superfortress around him, and the terrible realization struck him like a physical blow. The humans had not run away to hide. They had retreated to build a trap, preparing to carry the universe's executioner away into the dark, offering themselves as the ultimate sacrifice. The projection of Camden Blevins dissolved into a shower of pale blue sparks. In the exact fraction of a second, the hologram vanished. The superfortress plunged into a violent, strobing crimson. The unnatural peace was shattered by a deafening mechanical shriek as every proximity sensor, deep space telemetry array, and gravitational warning system on the station triggered simultaneously. The entity was no longer merely restless. It had officially opened its eyes. Across the galaxy, near the opulent capitals of the inner rings, the fabric of reality began to tear. The dimensional barrier, stretched thin by a century of slipstream exploitation, completely fractured. The Iron Vanguard, tethered tightly to the human fortress, began receiving a torrent of desperate transmissions. With the advanced, faster-than-light optical arrays dead, these were archaic, unencrypted radio waves. They were the desperate, primal screams of doomed worlds bouncing across the agonizingly slow medium of standard space. Kalen grimly routed the audio to the command nexus. The sound was pure, undiluted nightmare. "The sky is bleeding," a hysterical planetary governor from the wealthy core world of Cilicia shrieked over the heavy static. "The stars are gone. There are arms coming through the clouds. Arms made of nothing. They are eating the light. Please, send the fleet. Send anyone. It is taking the air. The entity was manifesting in the physical universe. Colossal appendages of pure, writhing antimatter were dragging themselves through the spatial rifts. These were not limbs in any biological sense, but localized distortions of physics, wrapping around grand orbital stations and crushing them into subatomic dust without a sound. Gravity itself inverted on the core planets. The sheer mass of the waking creature ripped oceans from their ancient beds, pulling entire continents upward into the jaws of the cosmic parasite. The Vorthan tactical officers, hardened veterans of dozens of brutal border skirmishes, physically collapsed to the deck of the fortress. One wept openly, his heavy mandibles trembling as he listened to the screams of billions burning in the radio static. Another officer simply stared at his plasma rifle and laughed. It was the hollow, broken sound of a mind snapping under the weight of utter insignificance. They had spent their entire lives priding themselves on their dreadnoughts, their fusion lances, and their supposed military supremacy. Now, staring at the telemetry of entire star systems being devoured by the very space they occupied, they realized the horrifying truth. The mighty Galactic Alliance, with its thousands of worlds and trillions of citizens, was nothing but a colony of blind ants staring up at an apocalyptic firestorm. There was no brilliant tactic to deploy. There was no super weapon to fire. There was only the end of everything. But Kalen refused to break. He slammed his heavy, armored fist onto the main console, the harsh, metallic crack snapping his crew out of their paralyzed stupor. "Stand up!" he roared, his voice cutting through the panic. "We are not dead yet!" He turned away from the agonizing audio feeds and stared intensely at the structural schematics of the human superfortress glowing on the secondary monitors. His eyes raced across the impossible geometry of the welded hulls, the massive fusion cores, and the strange, repeating acoustic nodes that had almost put them to sleep earlier. He remembered the dark bags under Blevins' eyes. He remembered the architect saying the entity fed entirely on consciousness. Kalen looked at the massive array of antenna-like spires protruding from the outer hull of the station. "This is not a defensive bunker," Kalen muttered, his mind accelerating as the impossible pieces aligned. "Look at the energy routing. None of the power is directed inward to shield generators or weapon banks. All the fusion energy is directed outward, straight into those massive communication arrays. This is not a gun. This is a megaphone. It is a psychological signal amplifier of godlike proportions." Kalen shoved his lead technician aside and began physically tearing into the primary data drive. He overrode the standard Alliance command protocols, slicing directly into the deepest, highly encrypted layers of Camden Blevins' personal directory. He needed to know where the human fleet had gone. He needed to know what they were planning to do with a universe-sized amplifier. The encryption fought back viciously, but Kalen used the brutal, primitive hacking algorithms he had just learned from the Tar Corsairs. The final firewall shattered like glass. A single, glowing set of coordinates materialized on the main screen, pulsing with an intense, golden light. It was a location at the absolute furthest edge of the gray abyss, hanging perilously over an endless drop into intergalactic space. The true scale of the human plan finally unfolded before him in a terrifying display of raw, undeniable data. The humans had not just evacuated their military assets. They had evacuated everyone, every single civilian, every child, every elder. 30 billion human beings were packed into thousands of hastily retrofitted, overcrowded colony ships. They were not running away to start over. They had deliberately positioned their entire civilization at the edge of the void, directly in the path of the awakened entity. Kalen read the final command sequence and felt all the blood drain from his face. The humans were weaponizing their unique neural density. They were currently synchronizing the brainwaves of all 30 billion citizens through a massive, centralized psychic link. They planned to broadcast that unfathomably massive, unified consciousness directly through the superfortress amplifier. They were going to light up the dark like a psychic supernova. They were turning their entire species into the most irresistible, blinding bait in the universe, willing to drag the apocalyptic hunger of the cosmic parasite away from the vulnerable, terrified worlds of the Alliance. The psychic beacon ignited. It was not a flash of light, but a shockwave of pure, condensed consciousness roaring across the absolute zero of the void. 30 billion human minds, synchronized through the archaic arrays of the superfortress, screamed into the dark with one unified, defiant voice. The sheer density of their collective brainwaves was a blinding sun in the psychic spectrum. The effect was instantaneous. The colossal entity, which had been hungrily tearing into the rich, populated worlds of the inner rings, suddenly stopped. Its infinite maws of antimatter paused their feast. The unimaginable hunger of the cosmic predator snapped its attention away from the scattered, terrified billions of the Galactic Alliance. It tasted something richer, something impossibly dense, waiting at the very edge of the gray abyss. Slowly, with the horrifying grace of a deep-sea leviathan, the multidimensional parasite pulled its crushing mass out of the Alliance space. The rifts over the sovereign worlds closed. The creature turned its impossible bulk and began to slither through the dark, accelerating straight toward the defenseless, screaming beacon of humanity. High Inspector Kalen stood perfectly still in the command nexus. He realized the humans were going to die in the dark, entirely alone, unacknowledged by the very empires they were saving. He could not allow that. He would not allow that. Kalen's 4 hands flew across the master terminal. He inverted the primary transmission protocols of the amplifier fortress. He took the live, raw visual telemetry of the human fleet and slammed it into every surviving communication relay, every emergency broadcast system, and every planetary optical grid left functioning in the galaxy. On thousands of dying worlds, the rioting ceased. The starving, terrified masses of the Alliance, species who had spent their entire lives draped in arrogance and wealth, stopped tearing at each other's throats. Giant, holographic billboards in the ruined skies of the capitals suddenly flared to life. Planetary defense monitors flickered. Everywhere, the citizens of the galaxy were forced to look up and bear witness. They saw the human fleet. It was not a majestic armada of sleek, silver cruisers. It was an ugly, brutal wall of survival. Thousands upon thousands of blocky, scarred colony ships, repurposed freighters, and heavy industrial mining rigs were lined up in the eternal night. The humans were physically linking their ships together, extending massive magnetic grapples and welding their hulls into a single, fragile shield wall, hanging over the infinite drop of intergalactic space. The species they had mocked as biological tools, the lowly mechanics and disposable fuses of the Alliance, were standing their ground against a god. Then, a voice cut through the silence of 1,000 worlds. The direct, unencrypted transmission of Camden Blevins echoed from the rusted speakers of slums to the grand halls of the High Council. "We lulled it to sleep for 1 century, so you could live in an illusion of peace." The human architect spoke, his voice completely devoid of fear, vibrating with a cold, terrifying resolve. "We paid the toll with our own minds while you built your utopias. Now, the debt is called in. We are going to drag it into the grave with us. The rest of the universe. You must learn to survive on your own." Kalen felt a heavy, cold tear trace down his chitinous cheek. He looked closer at the structural scans of the human armada transmitting across his console. Something was fundamentally missing from their ships. He cross-referenced the mass signatures and the energy outputs, and the final, crushing truth of the human plan snapped into focus. "They have no engines," Kalen whispered, the words choking in his throat. "By the ancestors, they have no engines." The human fleet had not just stopped at the edge of the abyss. They had completely dismantled their faster-than-light drives, their fusion thrusters, and their navigational cores. They had systematically stripped every single piece of propulsion technology from their 30,000 ships. They had zero physical means of retreat. They had used all of that highly volatile, exotic matter to forge something else entirely. Hidden directly behind their shield wall of civilian ships, anchored in the dead space, was a colossal, artificial anomaly. It was a gravity cage, an incomplete, massive singularity weapon built from the cannibalized heart of their own fleet. They were not trying to fight the entity. They were trying to trap it, using themselves as the literal bait to lure it into the center of the cage. The situation, however, was already spiraling into absolute ruin. The multidimensional parasite finally collided with the human defense line. It did not attack with lasers or kinetic bombardments. It attacked with the fundamental pressure of reality. The entity extended its spatial maws, twisting the laws of physics around the human ships. Kalen watched in horrified awe as the outer rim of the human shield wall simply began to fold inward. Massive, heavily armored colony ships groaned and warped, their superstructures snapping like dry twigs under the invisible, crushing weight of the creature's presence. Thousands of lives were extinguished in the blink of an eye, as sections of the barricade were compressed into spheres of raw iron and flesh. The human ships fired back with everything they had: primitive railguns, nuclear torpedoes, and concentrated fusion lances painted the dark with desperate fire. But the weapons passed directly through the shifting, non-Euclidean anatomy of the parasite. No conventional weapon could stop a creature made of warped dimensions. The shield wall was shattering. The entity was pushing deeper, its cosmic jaws opening wide to swallow the screaming psychic beacon of 30 billion souls whole. The trap was set, the bait was taken, but the jaws of the gravity cage remained devastatingly silent. Humanity was dying, inch by inch, holding the line against the impossible. The multidimensional parasite fully crossed the threshold. Its massive, shifting form of warped reality slid perfectly into the dead center of the gravity cage. On the command deck of the human flagship, Camden Blevins slammed his hand down on the primary ignition sequence. The entire human shield wall braced for the end. Nothing happened. Instead of the tearing roar of a collapsing singularity, the human fleet's comms channels were flooded with the shrill, terrifying sound of automated error alarms. A catastrophic physics miscalculation flashed across the telemetry. The localized spatial rift generated by the cage was violently rejecting the dimensional weight of the entity. They were missing mass. Exactly 10% of the concentrated physical matter required to snap the pocket dimension shut was lacking. The human ships had stripped everything, but it was not enough. The cage was stalling, and the entity was already beginning to tear its way out, its antimatter maws shredding the outer rings of the cage. The ultimate sacrifice of the human race was about to fail. Aboard the Iron Vanguard, Kalen watched the tactical display turn completely red. He saw the human defense line buckling under the cosmic pressure. The realization hit him with crushing weight. The humans were going to die, and the beast would turn its infinite hunger back upon the rest of the galaxy. "No," Kalen growled, his voice vibrating with absolute defiance. "I will not let this be the end." He shoved his communications officer aside and took manual control of the Vanguard's broadcasting array. He activated the Omega Protocol, the absolute highest tier of emergency override in the Galactic Alliance, a frequency hardwired into every single vessel across the 10,000 worlds. "This is High Inspector Kalen," he roared into the open channel, his voice echoing across the dying stars. "The humans are holding the executioner of our universe at the edge of the abyss. They have built a trap, but they do not have the mass to close it. I am calling every warship, every merchant freighter, every civilian transport, and every scavenger vessel that still has a working fusion drive. We have lived as parasites on their suffering for a century. Do not die as cowards in the dark. Fly to these coordinates. Fly now. For one agonizing minute, there was only the sound of static and the horrific screams of the human ships being crushed. Kalen gripped the edges of his console, his secondary heart sinking. The Alliance was too arrogant, too terrified. They would never come. Then, the tactical scanners of the Vanguard screamed. It was not a single blip. It was a tidal wave. The absolute darkness of standard space behind the human shield wall erupted in a blinding storm of fusion flares. Tens of thousands of ships tore out of the void. They were not flying in pristine military formations. It was a desperate, jagged armada of everything that could still move. There were the majestic, golden cruisers of the Silesian elite, battered and scarred. There were massive, bulky Vorthan industrial haulers. There were even the jagged, terrifying raider ships of the Tar Corsairs, flying side by side with the very planetary defense forces that used to hunt them. The entire surviving galaxy had answered the call. "We are here, Inspector," a fractured voice crackled over the radio, belonging to a Silesian Grand Admiral. "But our weapons cannot lock onto that anomaly. What do we shoot?" "You do not shoot," Kalen broadcasted, his voice filled with a terrible, beautiful realization. "They do not need your weapons. They need your weight. Aim for the core of the cage." The alien commanders did not hesitate. The age of arrogance was completely dead. One by one, the captains of the supreme species ordered their crews into escape pods, or simply locked themselves in their command chairs. They disabled their safety protocols. They overloaded their fusion engines. The grand, patchwork armada of the Galactic Alliance accelerated past the battered human shield wall and plunged directly into the howling vortex of the gravity cage. They slammed their massive, heavily armored hulls straight into the Singularity Forge. Silesian gold, Vorthan steel, and Corsair iron melted together in the intense gravitational shear, physically becoming the missing anchor the cage desperately needed. The alien ships voluntarily crushed themselves into pure, concentrated mass. The telemetry numbers on Kalen's screen skyrocketed. 92%, 95%, 99%, 100%. The gravity cage achieved perfect critical mass. The artificial singularity detonated. It did not explode outward in a ball of fire. It collapsed perfectly inward with the infinite, irresistible force of a dying star. The multi-dimensional parasite shrieked a silent, psychic scream that shattered the glass on 1,000 ships. The collapsing gravity well grabbed the cosmic predator and violently ripped it out of the physical universe, dragging it entirely into a microscopic, hermetically sealed pocket dimension. A single, blinding shockwave of pure white light washed over the entire expanse of the gray abyss, wiping the space entirely clean. Then, there was only a profound, impossibly gentle silence. The monstrous entity was gone. The tear in reality was flawlessly stitched shut. The old slipstream network, the vascular system of the beast, was permanently dead. There would be no more faster-than-light travel. The era of instantaneous, lazy supremacy was over. Kalen looked out of the shattered viewport of the Iron Vanguard. Floating in the vast, quiet ocean of the eternal night were the survivors. Thousands of crippled human colony ships and the battered engine-less husks of the Alliance vessels drifted side by side. They were stranded in the deep dark, months or perhaps years away from the nearest habitable world. But they were alive, and for the first time in galactic history, they were truly equal. The comms console chirped with a localized, low-frequency ping. "Inspector Kalen!" The exhausted, ragged voice of Camden Blevins crackled through the speakers. There was no bitterness left in his tone, only the heavy relief of a man who had finally put down an impossible burden. "We have an extra seat in the main command module. Care to come over and help us figure out how to get all these people home?" Kalen smiled, leaning back in his chair. "I am on my way, Architect." A new era had begun. It was not built on the back of a sleeping monster, nor was it constructed from the arrogant illusions of superior species. It was built from the ashes of pride, anchored by the ultimate sacrifice, and bound together by the solid, unbreakable foundation of mutual respect. Thank you so very much, dear listeners, for joining me on this incredible journey to the end of the stars. I would love to know, where in the world are you listening from today? Please drop your city or country in the comments below. If you found today's story thrilling and want to help us keep this universe alive, please consider supporting the channel with just $1. You can scan the donation QR code right here on your screen, or use the link provided in the description and the pinned comment. Your support is the only thing paying our hardworking staff, helping them feed their families, and allowing us to keep creating the sci-fi epics you love. Until the next transmission, stay safe out there in the dark.